Now that we have the entire iPod Classic collection here, let's take a look and compare them generation to a generation. The first generation iPod Classic came out in October 2001. Second generation came out in July 2002. The third generation came out in April 2003. Fourth generation had two variants. One came out in July 2004 and was just the monochrome screen, and in October 2004 the iPod Photo came out, which had a color screen, and that's what this model happens to be. The fifth generation iPod Classic came out in October 2005. The sixth generation iPod was the first to be called Classic. It came out in September 2007. Now let's talk about the click wheel, which have evolved considerably since the original was introduced. The first iPod actually had a scrolling wheel. It was the only one to do so. It also had these physical buttons along the side. So menu, play, pause, forward, and reverse were physical buttons beside the click wheel. The second generation introduced a touch-sensitive click wheel, so there's no physical wheel moving, but the buttons remain the same. The third generation saw a big change. We went from a physical button layout to a capacitive button layout. So now the auxiliary controls that were around the click wheel are now under the screen, and we have this touch-sensitive click wheel here. Essentially, this is one piece of molded plastic with indentations for the controls. Even the center button is touch-sensitive. There was no physical buttons. Fourth generation iPod Photo introduced the click wheel we know and use today, and it's essentially an all-in-one system where the menu, play, pause, skip, and back are all integrated into a single click wheel. So instead of clicking a separate button, you just click down on the scroll wheel. The fifth generation carried over the click wheel from the fourth generation, and of course the sixth generation is largely unchanged. Now, in order to sync and charge your iPods, there are important things to keep in mind about the earlier generations. Most of us take for granted that everything charges through USB. Back in the early days, Apple used FireWire. Now, FireWire allowed you to charge and sync to your computer. So both the first and second generation were FireWire-only devices. By the time the third generation came around, Apple introduced the 30-pin USB dock, which allowed you to sync but not charge your third generation iPod. If you wanted to charge, you still had to connect a FireWire cable to this 30-pin dock. And of course, Apple still uses this 30-pin dock in all of its portable products today. The fourth generation was the first to enable USB charging on the iPod, and you could still use FireWire for both charging and syncing. But by the time the fifth generation came around, you could only use FireWire for charging and not syncing. Essentially, the iPods became USB products from then on. Now, when talking about the iPod screens, it's interesting to note that the iPad has only had one size increase its entire lifespan, and that was with the fifth generation. So both the fifth generation and sixth generation have the same screen size, as do the first, second, third, and fourth gen. The only thing that has changed is what's behind that screen. The first and second generation iPods are largely the same. They're both backlight LCD panels, which are monochrome. And if you look at the third generation, you see it's a little sharper and it's a little bluer, and the color is more consistent. These are noticeably blotchy by comparison. And of course, the fourth generation introduced a color screen, which was a much higher res display as well. Unfortunately, my battery's dead, so I can't show a comparison. And the fifth generation introduced an even higher res screen, a screen capable of displaying video. And the sixth generation also saw a screen quality increase, so much higher res screen for a much more vivid UI. Now, in terms of capacity, the first generation was initially available only in 5 GB and then became available in 10 GB. It's one of the reasons that this was the only iPod to not indicate the size on the back, and I'll show you that later. The second generation was available in 10 and 20 GB. Third generation was available in quite a few sizes: 10, 15, 20, 30, and 40 GB. The fourth generation was available in 20 and 40 GB, and later when the when the photo version came out, it was available in 30, 40, and 60 gigabyte. The 5th generation was available in 30 and 60 gigabyte initially, and then an 80 gigabyte model was launched several months later. Sometimes this is referred to as the 5.5 generation. When we talk about the capacity of the 6th generation, it gets a little more complicated. The 6th generation originally came out in 2007. And that was available originally in 80 gigabyte and 160 gigabyte. In September 2008, Apple discontinued the 80 gigabyte and 160 gigabyte and released a 120 gigabyte model. So essentially, we lost the top end model and the largest iPod was no longer available. Thankfully, in September 2009, the 120 gigabyte model was replaced with the 160 gigabyte model. And this is often referred to as the 7th generation. And when we look at the top, we see quite an evolution in the design. First and second generation had full FireWire cables that plugged right into the top of them, while the headphone jacks were also unique. They were mounted in the center at the top, and they had this ring around them which accepted an adapter or a remote controller, which used to be sold with the iPod. And of course, the FireWire ports disappeared entirely on the top, and instead Apple went to the 30-pin dock, starting with the 3rd gen. And we also see a change in the design of the remote input. Instead of being around the headphone jack, it's now separated. Apple finally lost the remote feature on the 5th generation iPod. The hold switch has certainly been redesigned and repositioned, so we can see this design on the 3rd generation pretty much carries over to the latest generation. It has shrunk in size a little bit, but that's about all. And we see that the headphone jack has gone from the center to the side. So once again, we look at the bottom here, we can see no dock connectors on the 1st and 2nd generation, and the dock connector appears on the 3rd generation iPod and continues until current day. Now if you look at the side, we can see that the thickness have changed, have gone down on virtually every model. Now thickness did vary depending on size, so this isn't a complete picture of how thick the iPods were at the time. For example, the 5th generation iPod Classic had two different sizes for the 30 gig and 60 gig model, while the 6th generation had only one size, at least in its later form. You can also see the design evolution from the side here. You see this hard-edged, you see the sharp edges on the 1st and 2nd gen. You can also see that the front plate has thinned out a little bit on the 2nd generation, while the 3rd generation is much more round, and that continued on for the 4th generation, and then we returned back to this sharp edge design on the 5th generation, and we moved over to an entirely metal design on the most current generation. And of course, if we look at the back, they all look basically the same. They all have the same stainless steel backing, which disappeared on basically all the other iPods except for the iPod Touch. It's interesting to note that the first iPod had this distinctive serif font, and by the 2nd generation we saw this iPod font appear, and this is the same design that they use currently. So in fact, let's compare them, 2nd generation and 6th generation. They look the same. Of course, the 2nd generation introduced the size marker on the bottom here, but otherwise the markings are the same. We even have the serial number down here. So in case you're curious what size these iPods are, this is 5 gigabyte, this is 10 gigabyte, this is 40 gigabyte, this is 60 gigabyte, 60 gigabyte, 120 gigabyte. So once again, that's Detroit Borg, now with a complete iPod collection. Thanks for watching.